Hey, welcome back everybody. We hope you've been joining us as we go from Petersburg out to where we now stand here at Appomattox Court House. This is part of a video swing where we're covering these important actions that happened from, say, late March until, April 9th and beyond, 1865. We're really happy to have Kris White behind the camera and our good friend Patrick Schroeder. He's the historian here at the Appomattox Courthouse, National Historic Park. Patrick, man, where are we and what do you have to say about it?
Well, we are in the middle of the village of Appomattox Courthouse. Right behind me is the courthouse building. It became the county seat in 1845. Interestingly enough, the courthouse building itself didn't have anything to do with the surrender meeting. The surrender took place down at the McLean House. But one of the most frequent questions we get, or ideas, is people come in here thinking that the surrender took place at the courthouse building.
Okay, but maybe you can clear this up for us, because I bet you if I check my phone, we're already getting comments on it. Is it a village, a town, or a courthouse?
Well, it is a courthouse. It is a county seat. Now, if you do it in writing properly, the town, which was about 120 people as of 1860, the town is courthouse, 2 words, capital C, capital H.
Okay.
That's the courthouse building, courthouse, 1 word.
Well, that actually helps to make sense, and that's far from the only courthouse around here. Kris behind the camera is no doubt thinking about Spotsylvania Courthouse as well.
And you see Wilmer McLean's home was in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. So the surrender took place at Appomattox Courthouse, but not in the courthouse.
Okay, good. So let's do a 360. Let's walk around Kris White while he pivots so we can show them the courthouse. Well, you tell us, what did this village consist of? What is it? We know there's a courthouse now and McLean lives here. What else is there?
So this area was tobacco country. They farmed tobacco here. This is the largest town in the whole county, but it's not that much. You got a general store, you have a tavern, a guest house, you have a few residents, which includes the Bocock home. Thomas Bocock was the only Speaker of the Confederate House of Representatives, but he had moved from here prior to the war, and Louis Isabel lived there. The county clerk lived at the other end of the village. So, it doesn't seem like much to us today, and it wasn't that much back then, really.
We have a fight at Appomattox Station on April 8th. We
Yes.
have a fight right down this road within my field of vision. Look, Kris, right over there's the kind of final fight here on April 9th, okay?
Yes.
But in the meantime, General Lee and General Grant are talking about
Yes.
surrendering, right? Could you get into that a little?
Yeah, so after the battles of Salish Creek on April 6th, when Grant arrives in Farmville on April 7th, Dr. Smith says that he thinks, Dr. Smith ran into his cousin, Richard Ewell of the Confederate Army. Smith was a Virginian, but still remained in the United States Army. And he thought, Ewell told Smith that he thought Lee would surrender if Grant asked him to. So at 5 o'clock at the Prince Edward Hotel, or the Randolph House Hotel in Farmville, Grant writes his first letter to Lee asking for his surrender. When Lee receives it near Cumberland Church, he gives it to James Longstreet, Pete Longstreet, and Longstreet says, not yet. But Lee thinks he should write back to Grant and find out what kind of terms would he get if he wanted to surrender, because he is dealing with a guy known as Unconditional Surrender Grant, right? And so Lee writes back asking the terms. So that opens 3 days of correspondence between Lee and Grant.
So Patrick, let's orient everyone where the armies are right now. What are we talking about sizes first off between the Union and Confederate, and where are Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee in relation to where we're standing?
Sure. So over behind us here in the Appomattox River Valley, that's where Lee's army arrives on April 8th. On the morning of the 9th, they come up through the village, they open the road to the west until the Federal infantry show up and push them back into the Appomattox River Valley. At that time, the Confederate Army is about 4 miles from the front rank to the rear rank, where Lee's Longstreet is out at New Hope Church. So you got about 30,000 Confederates in there. And Lee started off this campaign with about 60,000 men. So he's lost about half of his army on the way here to Appomattox. The Federal armies are all around. Off to the west is the Army of the James. Off to the south is the Federal 5th Corps under General Griffin. Off to the southeast is General Custer's division and Tom Devens. And then when you go north of the Appomattox River, behind Longstreet is the Army of the Potomac with the 2nd and 6th Corps under General Meade.
And so what we're seeing is basically Lee's moving from Petersburg out. It's a constant game that Grant really wanted since 1864, early 1864. Get Lee into the open where I can maneuver and use my numbers against him. And now we're starting to see Lee not quite surrounded, but it's really coming to that point.
Yeah, he's effectively surrounded because he can't go west, he can't go south, he can't go northeast. The only way to go is north, but there's the James River. And the bridge has been burned over the James River, so he's effectively surrounded here.
And so now, the evening of April the 8th, we have Lee meeting with Fitzhugh Lee. He meets with John Brown Gordon, James Longstreet.
Right.
Basically say, let's try to break out.
Yes.
That failed. We had that in another video. So it comes down to the question, should we surrender or not? And I think a few Confederates, such as Henry Wise and William Pendleton, had suggested to Lee earlier that we should surrender, and we're only really following you at this point, that the government's really given out because Richmond's fallen, Petersburg's fallen. What's the mindset, do you think, of Robert E. Lee? Because he's the one who's going to make this decision ultimately.
Yeah, really when he finds out the infantry, Federal infantry has arrived, that's the signal that it's over. And they begin to withdraw once the Federal infantry arrives on the scene. So I think at that point they had done all they could. E.P. Alexander makes that suggestion that they break the army up and go fight in the hills. At this point, I don't even think that's a realistic option.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, E.P. Alexander's an artilleryman firing from a mile away. The infantry guys, Gordon and Longstreet, aren't suggesting this. But at that time, even Lee said, how many do you think would get away? You know, 10,000? Well, I don't even think 10,000 would get away. How are you going to get them through the Federal lines to get to the mountains, you know? So I don't even think that's a realistic possibility.
Yeah, we'll take a walk to the McLean House in a moment, because now what we've seen is that flip. At the beginning of the war, the Confederate cav is so powerful, you know, it has that myth that they're always going to outride and outfight the Federals, and now it's on the opposite shoe, the shoe's on the opposite foot, where the Union now, anytime Lee moves, you have Custer, you have Merritt, you have Tom Devin, George Crook, they're all over this place, and it seems like especially Custer is omnipresent during this campaign, and I think you have Phil Sheridan, love him or hate him, throughout this campaign, his #1 command was drive them, drive them, drive them, and that's what they're going to try to keep doing. So breaking away, I think, is just unrealistic.
Sure, and keep in mind too, a lot of that Federal cavalry, not a good number of regiments are starting to have repeating carbines, Spencers.
Yeah.
The 1st Maine has Henry rifles, and they're part of the roadblock up here. So you're getting more and more firepower in those cavalry units.
So you have 7-shot Henry or Spencers. You have 16-shot Henrys at that point. I mean, you can lay down a base of fire, and this comes into play at Sailor's Creek. Check out that video with like the 37th Massachusetts laying down their fires with Spencer. So it's interesting to see that now it's all coming together here. We talk about this industry of the North. We see the numbers of the North, and everything's starting to break down. I mean, sometimes that's overplayed, but it really plays out here in this campaign.
Yeah, Grant ends up here with about 65,000 men surrounding Lee's 30,000. So now the one thing, you mentioned Confederate cavalry. So apparently Fitzhugh Lee got permission from Uncle Robert the night before that if there was going to be a surrender, that he could escape with as much cavalry as he could and go join Joe Johnston. So when the Federal infantry arrives, Fitz Lee rides off with 2 divisions of cavalry. Tom Rosser and Tom Mumford, and they actually escape from surrendering here and go to Lynchburg, and they are going to rendezvous in a week and go join Joe Johnston, but a week later they find out that Johnston has suspended hostilities, so they just disband and go home. So, but they are truly Confederates that don't surrender. That were here at Appomattox. So.
Let's take a walk over to the McLean House, and let's cover that here. So we have the Confederates coming up here, and the idea is to try to get to Joe Johnston's army. So there are a lot of moving parts right now. April 9th, 1865, Joe Johnston's army is taking on William T. Sherman's, what we call today, Army Group, down in the Carolinas. Down in Mobile, Alabama, we're about to have the big fight at Fort Blakely. So that city's going to fall in just a few days. And now up here at Appomattox, we have Robert E. Lee, who's trying to hook up with Joe Johnston. And you know, this is the ultimate goal, is to turn south, but Grant
Sure.
keeps forcing them west.
Yeah, this whole campaign really is like a chess match. Grant keeps putting Lee into check, and Lee gets out of it. But here on April 9th, he's put in checkmate.
Yeah, and I want to remind you, we do have battle apps over at battlefields.org. You can go check those out in the Google Play Store, as well as over at the Apple Store. We also have other videos here on our YouTube channel, so please share this with your friends, your family. Check out the National Park Service's site. They have a lot of great information, and they even use some of our maps from the American Battlefield Trust to illustrate this campaign in some of the battles. But Patrick, as you pointed out, you know, most people think the surrender took place at the courthouse, but it actually took place in this home just over here, Wilmer McLean. Why don't we talk about him for a moment? Because it seems like you have some strong feelings, or at least some people have some strong feelings about Wilmer McLean.
Yeah, I think Wilmer McLean is at least misunderstood in history, but part of it is his own doing. Wilmer McLean was a merchant from Alexandria, Virginia. He married a widower that lived at Manassas, had a home called Yorkshire out there that General Beauregard made his headquarters. And the McLean story was that, you know, a cannonball struck the kitchen and spoiled General Beauregard's supper, which is true. The thing is, Wilmer McLean wasn't there at the time. They had left the area, rented the house to the Confederate Army. He was a merchant, and whenever you see programs that mention Wilmer McLean, they want to make you feel sorry for him, because they'll say the war started in his front yard and ended in his parlor.
And Wilmer McLean could rightfully say that the war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor.
Poor old Wilmer McLean. Well, you know who's responsible for that story?
Wilmer McLean.
Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean would tell people that. But of course, the first fighting is at Manassas. It's at Fort Sumter, and there's an engagement at Big Bethel and elsewhere prior to the fight at Manassas. And of course, this isn't the last fight of the war here at Appomattox, but he would tell people that. And we have accounts of him where he says similar things, and then he might say, would you like to buy my autograph? But Wilmer McLean, he was a merchant, and what he was involved in the Civil War was buying up sugar. He would buy up sugar that was brought in through the blockade, and then he would warehouse it, and he'd sit on it. And you know what the price of sugar did during the war?
Oh, skyrocketed.
Yeah, up. He'd resell it, reinvest some of that money, buy more sugar, sell it. So what is Wilmer McLean?
He's a war profiteer.
Those are the exact words I was going to use. He's a war profiteer. Of course, all his profit is in Confederate money. So on April 9th, his money is worth nothing. But if it retained its value, I figured out one time he would have been worth between $1 million and $1.5 million. So Wilmer McLean was doing pretty good on the war. So maybe you don't feel too sorry for Wilmer McLean having the war start in his front yard and end in his parlor.
It's like one of the stories out of Sailor's Creek, when the Union captures all that Confederate money, and then they started actually handing it out to the Confederate prisoners kind of as an insult, and they had some of the biggest bets that evening when they were playing poker.
The antes were $10,000 to get in, Confederate money. So after the war, Wilmer McLean, they left here in 1867, went back up to Manassas, and he somehow got elected the mayor of Manassas. And when Grant becomes president, he gets a letter from Wilmer McLean. And I'll just paraphrase using my words, it's entertaining. It basically says, hey, President Grant, you remember me? You received Lee's surrender at my house. I'm now a Republican, and I supported you in your last election. I would like a job. And wouldn't you know it, Grant wrote 3 letters of recommendation for Wilmer McLean, got him a job in the Treasury Department. Wilmer McLean spent the rest of his life as a U.S. government employee, thanks to U.S. Grant.
Seems like he's a little bit of an opportunist on top of...
I would think so, yeah, for sure.
So let's set up the stage here. It's April 9th, 1865. Robert E. Lee has decided to come over and meet with Ulysses S. Grant. We don't know if he's going to surrender yet or not.
Right.
So what would it look like here in the village? Is this a no man's land, or we have...
This is basically between the lines.
Okay.
The village, The 24th Corps, 25th Corps stopped up on top of the ridge. The 5th Corps stopped down around Plain Run. The Confederates get driven out of the village. There are 5th Corps skirmishers in the village, but it's basically between the lines. We had talked about Grant and Lee corresponding. Grant's last message to Lee says for Lee to find a suitable place to meet. That message is delivered by Orville Babcock to Lee under an apple tree down by the Appomattox River. Charles Marshall of Lee's staff comes into the village, encounters Wilmer McLean. McLean offers a building that Marshall finds unsuitable. Then McLean offers his own home.
Okay.
At that point, Marshall goes back, gets Lee, Babcock, and an orderly, William McKee Dunn, Babcock's orderly, and they ride over here to the McLean house. It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, Grant started that morning 22 miles away from here, and he has no idea the surrender is going to take place because Lee's last message said he didn't want to meet to discuss surrender. He just wanted to meet to discuss peace, which is something totally different than surrender. So Grant on April 9th thinks this is a day of battle, and where he wants to be is not in the rear. He wants to be to the front where the action is with Ord and Sheridan. So what he has to do is ride a semicircle around the Confederate army to get to the southern pincer of his armies. So he's on this 22-mile ride. He gets that note from Lee about 11 o'clock. They read it, say they call for 3 cheers. The cheers turn into tears, and then he sets out to get over here and meet Lee. So he has to continue that 22-mile ride. Does it pretty timely though. He arrives within a half hour of Lee arriving here. So Lee had to ride about a mile. Grant rides 22 miles to get to this meeting. And you can understand when people say Grant had a muddy uniform. Well, sure.
Yeah.
Not only did Grant, his whole staff would have been mud covered because it was April in Virginia and there was a lot of rain, so there was mud everywhere.
And he's not insulting. Let's take a walk
So,
up this way.
yeah.
So he's not insulting Robert E. Lee. Some
No.
people think that he's trying to make him wait and he's trying to make him
Right.
sweat it out. It's basically he has to get here.
Yeah.
He's also, I know his dress uniform's in the rear. This is a campaign that's still in motion, and I think folks need to understand that we don't know the outcome if we're here in April of 1865. Does peace come? Will the negotiations break down and the hostilities begin? Because I know James Longstreet, at least in his memoirs, is stationed not too far from us, and he's ready to put up a rear guard if it comes to it.
Sure.
But I think the realization is from him, Gordon, and others, it's time. And Lee, of course, comes to that conclusion himself. So we come here. It's April 9th, 1865. What time is it? About 1:30 in the afternoon?
1:30 in the afternoon, Grant arrives, dismounts. He comes up these steps here, passes through the front door, and he meets Robert E. Lee in the parlor. They shake hands and fall into a discussion about their time in Mexico.
Okay.
Grant, of course, remembered it very well because Lee was the idol of the Army at the time. Lee recalled that they had met but couldn't remember features of Grant or the occasion. And apparently the conversation was so pleasant that it was Lee that called Grant's attention to the matter at hand and asked Grant to put his terms in writing. So Grant sat down at a wooden table, an oval wooden table, and wrote out the terms of the surrender. And they were very generous. The Confederate soldiers weren't going to be sent to prison camp. They were going to be paroled and allowed to go home. He's going to allow the officers to keep their sidearms and personal baggage. Eventually, he will include horses being allowed to take
Because Lee
home.
asked for that, I believe.
Lee did ask. He pointed out that their men own their own horses. Initially, Grant says no, but then he reverses himself and says he won't put it in the terms, but would give instructions to allow the Confederates to keep their horses. And then he also agrees by the end of the meeting to send rations down to feed Lee's army. So very, very generous terms, all considering.
Because it's about 25,000 rations he calls for.
He says,
initially.
for 25,000 rations to be sent down there, yeah.
And we're going to get into this in another video, but it's also important. The men who are paroled here, there's more than 28,000 men who are paroled. They're going to receive a piece of paper, and that piece of paper is very powerful. It's not just that they're paroled by the Union Army, but it's their train ticket, a steamboat ticket, it's meals they can draw, rations, anything like that. And we'll talk about this in another video.
There's parole passes that show them being issued clothing, shoes, trousers, socks, undergarments on their way home. Most importantly, though, it protects them. It's protection. Protection from the Union Army, so they don't go through some other Union lines elsewhere away from Appomattox and get rounded up as a prisoner and sent north to prison camp. And when they go south, they promise not to take up arms against the United States again with this parole pass. It's showing that they can't be put back in the Confederate Army or executed as deserters. So those parole passes are treasured heirlooms of those Confederate soldiers.
Yeah, and so when Lee comes out, we've had the surrender, it's been signed. Lee comes out, Lee and Grant. What happens on this porch? You know, I've heard that, you know, Lee may have done something like this where he punches his hand, is it, you know, and rides off into the sunset. What would we see here?
Yeah, well, inside, before the end of the meeting, Grant introduces his staff to Robert E. Lee. And we don't know, most of the people Lee just nodded his head to. You know, Robert Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, was here. We don't know if Lee realized that, but when he's introduced to Ely Parker, Parker says that Lee said to him, "It's good to see one real American here." And Parker responded, "General, we're all Americans."
Because Parker's a Native American.
He is, yeah, but it's showing that they all came through this common experience and they were still all Americans. Lee comes out, looks to the direction of his army. He has new gloves on.
Okay.
He has put on a new uniform for this meeting. Some people say he smote his hand into his fist. Others seem to think that he was just trying to get those gloves to fit, which may be more likely. He calls for his orderly. They bring Traveler over to him. He mounts Traveler. Grant comes out on the porch, tips his hat to Lee. Lee tips his hat back. It's called the gentleman's salute. Lee will ride back to his army, let him know that they have been surrendered. And these initially met with cheers, but then they find out they've been surrendered. Those cheers turn to tears. He says, "Go home, men, and make as good citizens as you have soldiers. You will do very well, and I'll always be proud of you." When Grant leaves the McLean House, he rides off to the west to establish a tent site. His troops are firing muskets in the air, celebrating, and he says, "Stop the firing. The rebels are our countrymen again." So there's kind of an air of good feeling set forth from this meeting here at the McLean House.
And I want to close off here with two things. Number one, when Robert E. Lee came here, he doesn't know what's going to happen.
No.
He doesn't know that he could be potentially, I mean, he could be hanged for treason. He could be
Sure.
shot. He could be arrested. You know, so I think he shows up here. There's probably a tension. And then when Grant arrives and it's kind of relaxed, I think that gives him the opportunity to feel his way through all of this, because we don't know what's happening in real time.
Sure, and he puts on that new uniform because he says he expects to be General Grant's prisoner and wants to make his best appearance. So, yeah, he doesn't know for sure that his army will be paroled and allowed to go home. So like I was saying, the terms are just that generous. Of course, Lincoln had impressed upon Grant to let him up easy and to give these generous terms. To make those Southern soldiers United States citizens again in the future.
Which is probably one of Lincoln's last direct orders, is probably to a field commander. It's probably one of those last ones. And finally, and you're going to check out some other videos we have here with the passing of the armies. We also have some myths we're going to bust in another video. But the McLeans themselves, were they here during the negotiations?
Yeah, they were home. Marshall had met Wilmer McLean. He was 50 years old at the time. His wife, Virginia, was 48 years old and expecting at the time. So, but the family was home, probably in the basement, but they were around. Unfortunately, they never left any personal accounts of what transpired here in April 1865.
A bunch of their stuff walks out the door, right? Like Phil Sheridan buys a table for George Custer, and Libby ends up with it. There's a doll that was here that was taken by a Union soldier, and they're buying in a lot of the stuff, but some of it's also walking away.
Yeah, General Sheridan buys Grant's table for $20 in gold, and like you said, presents it to George Custer to give to Libby. General Ord gives McLean $40 in greenbacks for Lee's table. The chairs go for $10 a piece. And then Lula McLean, she didn't get well, Captain Moore of Sheridan's staff took the doll and said he gave her a replacement doll, but I don't know how many officers carried dolls around with them to trade out with anybody, so I don't know that that's true. But we have the doll on display in the visitor center.
We'll flash it up on the screen.
And that came back from the Moore family out of Mount Kisco, New York.
Nice.
In the 1890s. 1990s. They visited here and liked what we were doing and thought the doll should come back. And the McLeans knew it was up there. McLean descendants had been trying to get it back for years. The lady said that the men kept it as a war trophy and that the men were all dead. Now the ladies wanted it to come back to Appomattox. So now we get tens of thousands of visitors to view the doll every year, and it's a subject of numerous books and reproductions of the doll is made.
Yeah, one of my favorite artifacts in Europe is a teddy bear that a man from the 10th Armored Division went back into Bastonia to get for a child in Belgium in World War II. So I think there's that draw. Everybody had a doll or a teddy bear as a kid, and maybe that'll draw them in here. Patrick, we really want to thank you for bringing us here, and we'll show you more of Appomattox Court House, and we have more videos for you, so check those out. I want to thank Garry Adelman, who's behind the camera. I want to thank Patrick and the National Park Service for having us out, and thank you for supporting battlefield education and preservation on the American Battlefield Trust YouTube channel.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust's YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.